First passage is in Matthew 18, starting in verse 18. Jesus is talking to the disciples. He's actually been talking in the context of forgiveness and how the church treats other people in the church. And he says to the disciples, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And again, truly I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything and ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven." The first thing I want us to get from this passage is the key thing. What you bind on earth is bound in heaven, and that means that what we do here really counts. What we do here becomes part of forever. It becomes part of eternity. In the scripture we see that God could have decided to just wipe us out and do something different. That was what the flood was about. It was about what could have happened, and yet God chose not to do that. And when the Israelites sinned and broke away, God could have just let them be destroyed when they were conquered by the Babylonians, and chosen a whole new and different people and started over. But he didn't. And their sins, and the preaching the prophets against their sins, became part of their salvation and part of the story that they brought forward. We see this most importantly in the life of Jesus, where when God came to us to show us love and to teach us how to live, we put him to death. And God could easily have decided, okay, that's the end of that. I gave them their last chance, and just wiped us out and said, that's enough. But God didn't do that, and even the evil we did became part of the good that God had planned for us. Without the crucifixion, no resurrection. Without the crucifixion, evil is not destroyed. God has decided that what we actually do, for good or for ill, will be part of the pattern of everything that happens, that lasts into eternity. We even see in John's Gospel that when Jesus was raised up from the dead, he still had wounds in his hands and feet. He still had a hole in his side that he invited Thomas to put his hand in to see about it. Even in heaven and forever, Jesus is forever the crucified one, even if he is also forever the one who has been raised from the dead. We need to take this as a lesson. God's salvation doesn't wipe out the past, so it didn't happen. It incorporates the past in the good that God is doing now and forever. And that puts a heavy weight on us, because it means that everything we do counts. Everything we do matters. Everything we do is part of the way things will always have been. I want to read a passage from Paul's first epistle to Timothy. Timothy was a young Christian who became a convert to faith under Paul's ministry, and who then spent several years going around with Paul, acting mostly as a servant to him while Paul was traveling and preaching, but later sharing in the ministry. And towards the end of his time, Paul installed Timothy as the leader of a church in one of the cities. And when he himself was later in prison and no longer able to go around, he wrote to Timothy, and here's one of the things that he said to Timothy. This is in chapter 4 of the first epistle to Timothy, verses 12 through 14. He says, "Let no one despise your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. And until I arrive, give attention to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, and to teaching. And do not neglect the gift that is in you, which was given to you through prophecy, with the laying on of hands, by the council of elders. These are the words of the Lord. And that's the other thing I want us to take as a lesson this morning. That youth is no impediment to doing God's will. That youth is no impediment to being a leader in God's church. That youth doesn't mean that the things we do now won't matter. Even now, the things we do will affect the way things will be forever. I want to show us something now. Jack, I'm gonna, let's see. First I gotta close this. And minimize that. And now I'm going to, there's my cursor. This is a video I plucked off of Facebook. It's about a man who rescued some children during World War II. At the beginning of the war, rescued them from what would have been the death camps. Get back to our own. Have any of you seen this before? Some of you have seen it before. It's had 55 million views. It's also not quite accurate. He didn't do it single-handedly, but he was the driving force. He had to go to people in Czechoslovakia and say, will you house these children until I can get them on the train? He had to find a train and a business that would take them. He had to find people in England who would agree to sponsor them. The government required someone to deposit a fund, an amount of £50 for every child brought in, so that there would be money so that they could go back home later or not stay in Britain. He had to convince the government of the Netherlands to let the train full of children pass through the Netherlands to reach the port where it could go to Britain. He was the driving force, but he didn't do it single-handedly. And the video implies that it was all a secret for long years. He didn't keep it secret, but he didn't talk about it. It was known, and he mentioned it to some people, but it got forgotten. A lot of people did want to forget about the war and the mess. And 50 years later, his wife did find the book he'd kept, and they did do this television show. It said every person in the audience was a child he had saved. Now, the audience was bigger than that. And only about 4 dozen of them managed to come to the show. There were 669 children, and They were never ever able to find out what happened to about 250 of them. Probably things went okay for them, they just couldn't track them down. But what I want us to get out of this was, look, he didn't pull a sword, he didn't learn to fight, he wasn't a soldier in the war. He just did the kind of stuff that actually any ordinary businessman does, and that's what he was in life. He was a banker and a businessman. He put together the bits and pieces to make something happen. He wasn't spectacularly intelligent or gifted like Mozart. He wasn't a powerful fighter, and yet we always think of fighting against evil. That's the metaphor of our times. Superhero movies and adventures and shoot-'em-up games, that it's fighters who change things, not always. And most importantly, 10,000 times as many people as he saved still died in the concentration camps. There were about 6 million Jewish people who were put to death. There were about 6 million other people put to death in the concentration camps too. About 3 million of them were captured Russian soldiers. There were gypsies and homosexuals and prostitutes. Hitler was determined to get rid of anybody that wasn't part of a strong, powerful new state. But that doesn't matter, because we don't count human beings like that. We don't say 2 is more than 1. We don't say 6 million is more than 669. Every single person is of infinite value. Every single person is of infinite value. So if you save even one person, that's already infinite. And I won't bore you with mathematics, but infinity is the kind of thing where you don't get any bigger. That's already as big as it gets. There's a passage in the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, and it says, "In the name of Allah, the merciful, the glorious, I tell you this, whoever saves the life of one person, it is as if he had saved all of mankind." I want us to understand that size makes no difference. When it comes to doing things that matter, doing things that count, doing things that make a difference, that make an eternal difference, size doesn't count. Because every human being is of infinite value. And anything you do, anything, no matter how small it seems, that helps even one person, is of infinite value. And it doesn't matter that you can't save everyone. And it doesn't matter that you can't change the course of the history of the world. And it doesn't matter that you can't stop wars and persecution everywhere. If you stop them anywhere, even in one place, for one little time, then that changes what the world really is. By making it happen on earth, it happens in heaven. By being bound here, it's bound there. You do make a difference. You make a difference all the time. You make a difference whether you like it or not, too. If you sit and do nothing, then nothing will happen. Sir Wenton was not able to get more children out, partly because only Britain and Sweden agreed to take any. He asked the United States government to let him send children over here. And our government said, no, we're staying out of this war, we don't want a part of that. He couldn't get them to any other European nations, not even the ones that were neutral in the war. The people who did nothing affected things too. He estimated he might have been able to get another 3,000 children out before the shooting started at the beginning of the war, if he'd been able to find people who would take them. What you do makes the world what it is. You make the world happen. The real world. The one that will turn out to be the only world that did really exist or not. And though we trust in God, to make things turn out for good in the end. God is using us to do that. And what we do matters. I wanted also to make the point that you're never too young to do something that makes a difference. When Nicholas went and did this, he was 28. That's younger than some of you sitting here. William Pitt was the Prime Minister of England at the age of 24. Louis Braille, you've heard of Braille writing? Louis Braille, who was blind himself, invented Braille at the age of 15. Joan of Arc, you've heard of Joan of Arc? She went to the King of France and said, look, God has given me faith to believe that we can be a free nation and not oppressed by the English. She said, I've heard God speak to me in visions. I know it can be. She wasn't a fighter. She did suit up in armor and ride with the army, but she didn't carry any weapons and she didn't fight. She just rode with them. But because she believed that God was calling the people to gain their freedom, the army believed too, because of her, and was able to gain some freedom from the English. There's a girl, she's still alive now. Her name is Malala Yousafzai, and I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. But in the land where she lives, girls were often not allowed to be educated. Pakistan, it's a mostly Muslim country. Many conservative Muslim groups don't believe in educating women. She went to school and believed in girls being allowed to go to school. And she started at the age of 11 speaking up publicly about educating girls and letting them go to school. When she was 15 years old, they tried to kill her. She was badly wounded, shot. When she survived being shot, that made her famous. Not just some kid in the background working with some other organization giving speeches for them. She was awarded the Nobel Prize at the age of 17. There was a young boy named Iqbal Masih. He was sold at the age of 4 by his family to work in a factory as a bound servant working in the factory because they were trying to pay a debt they owed and they had nothing else to give. When he was 10, he escaped from the factory and he found a group called the Bound Labor Liberation Front, because in his part of the world many children were bound to the labor to work in factories. And he went to school with them, and then he went back where he had been and helped other people lead about 3,000 children out of bondage and into a place where they could be free and go to school. He was murdered at the age of 12. And I've chosen these examples, and you can go on the internet and find all kinds of examples of young people who did things that made a difference and that changed things. I chose these examples because none of these people were brilliant prodigies. They weren't magically, enormously intelligent. They weren't Mozart. They weren't Bobby Fischer. They weren't Robert Van Gulik, who could speak 11 languages by the time he was 13. They weren't magical prodigies. They were just people who decided that something had to be different and that they might as well go do it and make it happen. I can find stories of people who never did anything important until they were older, too. There are stories of people like Laura Ingalls Wilder and Immanuel Kant and Grandma Moses who never did anything that anyone thought was important until they reached the age where people normally retire. So there are stories at both ends. But most of us here are on the young end of things. And I want us to remember especially, and that's why I chose the story of Nicholas Winton, that scale, size, is an illusion in part. That the little things are just as big as the big things. Before I came here, I used to have lunch with Pastor Jimmy about once a month. And when he told me you were having a hard time finding someone for this ministry, someone to be permanently here, because it was only a half-time job, and all the really good people could get full-time jobs somewhere else, I told him, I said, I'd cut off my left arm for a chance to work with your young people. That's exactly what I said to him, sitting across the booth from him at Puja, an Indian restaurant. He said, oh, I didn't know you'd be interested. He said, wait until we see what happens with these latest. But if nothing comes of it, he said, then I'll write you and tell you to throw your hat in the ring. The reason I would say such a wild and spectacular thing, like I would cut off my left arm for the chance to come and work with you, is because I believe that you guys are able to make differences this big in what the world really is. Because this big means big enough to change one person's life. We're capable of doing stuff like that. We have done stuff like that sometimes in the past. We have done stuff like that and will do it again. And maybe some of you are doing it now and I don't know about it. There are lots of things we can do. We have done habitat projects before, and we don't always see the difference it makes later because we come in, we do a job, and we get out. We're probably looking for a chance to go maybe to Houston, maybe to Puerto Rico this summer to do work. You can imagine how much difference it will make to people to have a place to live again. There are different ministries that seek to take care of children and to see that they get medical care, get fed and housed, and are able to go to school. World Vision, Compassion International. If you can find $30 a month, you can make a difference of the size of one child with one of those ministries. Both of them are honorable ministries. $30 a month is what? 6 cafe lattes at Starbucks? I think about that. You wouldn't have to give up much. You wouldn't even have to go out and get a job if you don't have one yet, because I bet you're already spending $30 a month on things that don't necessarily make much of a difference to you. Something that we could look for a chance to do that would make a pretty significant difference is in New Brunswick and in other places around New Jersey where we live, there are communities that are poor enough that the local schools are heavily stressed. There are programs that set up to give people a chance to tutor young kids in stressed schools who aren't getting as good an education as they should and who need a little tutoring help. And if there's anything that we have in abundance, it's smarts and schooling. Of all the things that we are rich in, it's smarts and schooling. Maybe we should be looking for chances to tutor kids in at-risk schools. You're not too young to do something that makes a difference. And you're not too busy to do something that makes a difference. And you don't have to change the whole world in order to make a difference. You just have to change one person's life.